Let's shift our focus now to Africa's aviation sector, and the International Air Transport Association forecasts that global air travel growth, it sees global air travel growth of 4.9% in 2026, which is slightly below the 5.2% which was expected in 2025. Now, it also says that Africa is projected to exceed that global average with 6% growth in 2026. However, despite stronger than average demand in Africa's air transport space, African carriers still remain the least profitable worldwide. Of the $41 billion in global net profit forecast for this year, African carriers are expected to generate just $200 million in profit. Well, earlier I asked Kamil Al-Ahwadi, the Regional Vice President for Africa and Middle East at the International Air Transport Association, whether regulators or African carriers are to blame for the state of Africa's aviation sector. Take a look.
I think a large portion of the blame lies on the regulators. It's, the charges, taxes, and fees in Africa in general is very, very high, the highest in the world. And on top of that, the bilateral agreements between African countries are limited. SATM's been around so many years and still not implemented. There's a lot of policies that governments need to work together to eliminate and to assist the aviation industry.
So your position is that policy alone is enough to fuel that boom in Africa's aviation sector. So what role then do you think infrastructure development plays in the challenges that African airlines currently face?
Well, obviously infrastructure does have a role. With the current GDP and the average GDP in Africa, it becomes very hard for passengers to travel. They can't afford it.
And just before we talk more about regulation, I want to quickly get your take on the fact that we've seen major airlines such as Kenya's KQ and, of course, South African Airlines really struggling with their bottom lines. Do you at all think that this has something to do with how these airlines are run?
I think partly there is that, but again, when you have thin margins that the African airlines have right now because of the cost to operate in Africa, and obviously it's also the connectivity in Africa is hampering the airlines. That safe barrier that the airlines have to survive year over year becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. There are obviously other issues like the direct interference by government entities within their own government-owned airlines, tight regulations that make no sense to allow the safe, sustainable growth of the aviation industry in general, and the lack of investment by governments to reinvest in the infrastructure, which is surprising considering how expensive it is to operate to a particular airport in Africa, and none of the money and the revenue that comes from that airport from all the airlines are reinvested in the infrastructure.
Now, not only are you calling for governments to lift these restrictions, you're also saying they need to honor bilateral air service pacts, which have basically guaranteed access to airline revenues in US dollars. What do you think is standing in the way of governments implementing these changes?
I think their vision, I think governments generally in Africa see the aviation industry as an immediate cash cow. So they would tax the tickets and ask for more fees and charges from the airlines and its passengers, rather than try to encourage the aviation industry to grow. And an example, if you look at the recent developments that are happening in Rwanda, the opening up of all the visas to all of Africa, and how much that's assisted Rwanda's aviation industry to grow, and in return, how much revenue from the aviation industry has contributed into the GDP without the unnecessary increases in charges and taxes and levies. So Rwanda is taking one path, whereas other countries just simply add ridiculously high fees and charges and taxes onto the industry, onto the airlines itself, actually, without rethinking, what this airline is doing, and how sustainable that airline is if they keep adding these charges, and what contribution this airline could have to the country's GDP.
Well, there have been also market liberalization efforts or frameworks. We've had the Yamoussoukro decision. We've had the single African air transport market. When you look at those, have those been effective in improving connectivity across the continent? And are there any initiatives that are giving you some hope, such as the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? Are there any initiatives that are improving the outlook for connectivity?
Right now, for the aviation industry, I don't think. I mean, SATM is being handled by AFCAC, and they are trying. But to get 54 countries to sit on the table and agree on it is a different story. I don't believe right now SATM is anywhere close to being fully implemented in the correct manner. There's a lot of signatures, a lot of meetings, and and the heads of states or their ministers sit and agree on stuff, but it never gets implemented in the end. So if SATM did get implemented, that definitely will help the growth of the aviation industry in Africa and will help the airlines' bottom line improve. Okay, but in general, I don't think the representatives of each country have agreed and effectively implemented any of the SATM policies.
Of course, that's our discussion with Kamil Al-Rawadi, the Regional Vice President for the Middle East and Africa at IATA. Well,